So how was Donald Trump's inauguration speech? Well, in my opinion, it wasn't very good. It wasn't one of the greatest inauguration speeches. In fact, it was one of the poorest in my assessment of the last 50 years or so. There were no ringing phrases, there was no grand rhetoric, there was no enormous vision. In fact, it was more of a campaign speech. It was clearly aimed directly at his supporters. He talked about you and your country and indicated several times by his gestures the people who were there in Washington to listen to his speech, to be present at his inauguration. It was very much a speech for his supporters. Prior to the event, they talked about unity. His people had talked about unity. He talked about uniting America, and he made some reference to that. But really, it was more of a campaign speech than an inauguration speech. He was looking from one side to the other on his auto cue, and the fact that he was reading a speech rather than delivering a speech in the way that he often did during his campaign, with some ad-libs and some byplay with the crowd, made it a little bit dull. So I thought it was one of his poorest speeches, actually, of the last year or so. And given that it was such an important speech, a historic speech, I think he could have devoted a lot more time to it. So politics apart, from a technical point of view, it was a really poor speech. And I think it was poor because there wasn't any expert involvement. There were no speechwriters engaged. And although it got the message across, he made all sorts of promises like eliminating Islamic terrorism. And I think he talked about eliminating disease at one point as well. So he's got a lot to live up to. The speech wasn't really inspiring. The crowd was a bit sparse. There didn't seem to be a huge amount of enthusiasm in terms of applause and cheering and so on. And it was surprisingly flat. That may have been because he was reading it. He may be nervous, not used to giving those sorts of speeches, although he'd given lots during his campaign. So overall, I think it was a really rather poor performance from President Trump. And we'll see what happens over the days and months to come, over his first 100 days. But for inaugural speech, a pretty poor effort. So in terms of marks out of 10, for me, Donald, 4 out of 10.